4,000 years, dozens of authors, 3 continents, written in 3 languages across more than 1,000 years of history. And somehow, impossibly, it tells a single coherent story that arrives at a destination nobody saw coming, and that changes the shape of the entire world. The Old Testament is not a religious anthology. It is not a collection of moral lessons stapled together between 2 covers. It is the most ambitious piece of sustained narrative in the history of human writing, a book that begins before time existed and ends with an unanswered question that has been echoing through history for 2,000 years. And the astonishing thing is not that it exists. The astonishing thing is that it holds together. That the seeds planted in the first 3 chapters of Genesis are still germinating in the last chapter of Malachi, 400 years before Christ. That the promises made to one elderly nomad in the middle of the ancient Near East become the organizing principle of all subsequent human history. We are going to walk through the entire Old Testament, not as a survey of disconnected stories, not as a checklist of famous events, but as a single narrative with a single thread running through it. We are going to track that thread from the first word of Genesis to the last word of Malachi, and I think by the time we reach the end, you will understand something about this text that changes how you read every part of it. Let us begin at the beginning, which means literally before the beginning. Genesis chapter 1 verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In Hebrew, the opening word is bereshit, in the beginning. But here is what the Hebrew reveals that the English translation obscures. The phrase that immediately follows tohu vavohu means without form and void, formless and empty. Not darkness in the sense of a dark room where the light switch has been turned off. Nothingness in the most radical ontological sense. No space, no time, no matter. No framework in which matter could exist. The state the philosophers call ex nihilo, out of nothing. And before anything else existed, there was a voice. Let there be light. No tools, no pre-existing material, a spoken command, and the universe obeyed. What unfolds over the next 6 days in Genesis chapter 1 has been the subject of more commentary and more argument than perhaps any other passage in the history of literature. But here is what often gets missed in those arguments, the sequence. Day 1, light separated from darkness. Day 2, waters separated, sky established. Day 3, dry land, vegetation. Day 4, sun, moon, and stars organized. Day 5, marine life and birds. Day 6, land creatures, and finally, human beings. This is not random. It follows the shape of a craftsman creating a space, filling it, and then placing creatures in appropriate locations within it. And at the center of the creation account, a moment unlike any other. Let us make man in our image. The text does not say, let there be man, the way it said, let there be light. It says, let us, a deliberate internal consultation before the most significant act of creation. The plural has occupied theologians for centuries. It is at minimum a hint at the inner life of God, the plurality that the rest of Scripture will unfold as Father, Son, and Spirit. But the central claim is this: the human being was not spoken into existence from a distance. Genesis chapter 2, verse 7 says, God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. It is intimate. It is hands-on. It is radically different from everything that came before. God made the universe by speaking. He made a human being by bending down and breathing. Adam, the Hebrew word, simply means the man, drawn from Adama, the ground, woke up in a garden. And we need to understand that garden. The Hebrew word is Gan Eden. Eden means delight, pleasure, abundance. And the text is not describing an imaginary paradise. It mentions the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, rivers that still flow through modern Iraq. This was a real place in a real landscape. And at its center were 2 trees that would define the rest of the story: the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The rule was simple. Genesis chapter 2 verse 16 and 17. Of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. One prohibition in an entire world of freedom. Not a trick, not an obstacle course. A single, clearly stated condition with a clearly stated consequence. This is the original covenant, the first formal arrangement between God and a human being. The terms were explicit, the stakes were clear, and a world that had never known death was about to discover what it meant. Eve was formed from Adam's side, not from his feet to be. Walked on not from his head to dominate him, but from his rib, his side, to stand beside him as an equal companion. Together they were naked and unashamed. Try to sit with that for a moment. A world where nothing decays, nothing dies, nothing hurts, and nothing is hidden. Where there is no gap between who you are and who you appear to be. That was the original design. Into that perfection came a voice. Did God really say you shall not eat of any tree? The serpent, who appears here without explanation, without genealogy, simply introduced as more cunning than any other creature of the field, begins not with an outright lie but with a distortion. God said one tree. The serpent turns it into any tree, a subtle inversion that introduces the first seed of doubt in human history. You will not surely die. God knows that when you eat of it your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. The temptation is not an appeal to the grossly immoral. It is an appeal to the desire to have what God has, to be the center, the arbiter, the source of one's own definition of right and wrong. Eve ate. Adam, who was with her and silent through the entire conversation, the text says he was there, ate. And Genesis chapter 3 verse 7 records what happened in their eyes. The eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. They did not gain wisdom. They gained shame. The nakedness that had been completely unnoticed, 0 seconds of discomfort, became immediately unbearable. They sewed fig leaves together. And when they heard the sound of God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, they hid. That detail, God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, speaks of what had been normal, regular, unhurried physical presence. And now, for the first time, human beings are hiding from it. The consequences were surgical and permanent. For the serpent, to crawl in the dust forever, enmity with the woman and her offspring. For Eve, pain in childbirth, conflict in her marriage. For Adam, the ground that had produced fruit without resistance would now require thorns and sweat and labor, and even then would ultimately consume him. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return. Death entered human experience like a virus with no cure. They were expelled from the garden. A cherub with a flaming sword was placed at the entrance, turning every direction, guarding the way to the tree of life. The garden is closed. But in the middle of the curse on the serpent, God says something that is so understated it almost disappears. Genesis chapter 3 verse 15. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. The seed of the woman. A specific, future, singular offspring who will deal a fatal blow to the serpent, but not without being wounded in the process. This one sentence is the thread. This is the promise that every subsequent page of the Old Testament is either pursuing or preparing. We will come back to it. We will come back to it many times. Humanity has existed for one generation and has already lost everything. But wait, because what comes next is worse. Cain and Abel, the first two sons born outside the garden. Abel is a shepherd. Cain is a farmer. Both bring offerings to God. Abel brings the firstborn of his flock, the best, the finest, the first and most valuable. Cain brings an offering from the fruit of the ground, and the text's contrast with Abel's offering is deliberate. It suggests Cain did not bring his best. He brought something. God accepted Abel's offering and rejected Cain's. And from that rejection came the first human emotion that will haunt the Bible from this point forward. Envy. Dark, consuming, murderous envy. God comes to Cain personally, directly, individually. Genesis chapter 4 verse 6 and 7. Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. The image is extraordinary. Sin as a predator crouching at a door, waiting. God is warning Cain with the specificity of a father who sees what his son cannot yet see. The predator is right there. You can master it, and Cain ignores the warning. He takes his brother into a field and kills him, the first homicide in human history. And when God asks, "Where is your brother?" Cain responds with the sentence that echoes across 3,000 years of human civilization. "Am I my brother's keeper?" Cain is cursed. The ground will no longer yield for him. He becomes a wanderer. Abel's blood cries from the ground, and that phrase, blood crying from the ground, becomes a kind of legal testimony that runs through the entire Old Testament. Innocent blood has a voice. It does not remain silent. Generations multiply. The genealogies of Genesis chapter 5 record lifespans th. It seem impossible to us. Adam lived 930 years, Seth 912, Methuselah an astonishing 969. Whether these numbers are literal or whether the ancient world used a calendar system we no longer have access to, the text presents them straightforwardly, and embedded in that long list is one extraordinary anomaly: Enoch. Genesis chapter 5 verse 24. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. In a chapter whose refrain is, "And he died, and he died, and he died," Enoch does not die. He is simply taken. No grave, no burial, just gone. This solitary line will generate centuries of speculation, but in its context it is making a quiet but revolutionary claim. Death is not the only possibility. Walking with God closely enough produces a different outcome. Humanity continues to corrupt itself with frightening speed. Genesis chapter 6 opens with one of the most enigmatic passages in the entire Bible. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took them as wives. Fallen angelic beings. The godly line of Seth intermarrying with the line of Cain. Ancient kings exercising tyrannical sexual power. Each interpretation opens a different theological door. What is not in dispute is the result. Genesis chapter 6 verse 5. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Every intent, of every thought, continually, not mostly, not frequently, every thought all the time. And then the most profound verse in the chapter, Genesis 6 verse 6. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. The creator of the universe grieved in his heart. This is not cold anger. This is the pain of love disappointed. He determines to end it, all of it, and he will. But one man is set apart, Noah. Genesis chapter 6 verse 9. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. In a world where every thought was continuously evil, one man resisted, and God gives him the most extraordinary engineering commission in the ancient world: an ark 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet tall, 3 decks, coated with pitch inside and out. No sail. No rudder. No navigation system, because it was not designed to go anywhere. It was designed to float, to survive. 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 5 calls Noah a herald of righteousness. He was preaching while he built. For years, perhaps decades, he preached and built in plain sight. No one repented. No one joined him. And when the ark was finished and the animals had entered, Genesis chapter 7 verse 16 records the most chilling detail in the whole narrative. And the Lord shut him in. Not Noah, God. The door was closed from outside, by God. Whoever was inside was safe. Whoever was outside, it was over. 40 days of rain, but not only rain. Genesis chapter 7 verse 11, all the fountains of the great deep burst open. Water from beneath the earth, from the sky, from every direction. The mountains disappeared under more than 20 feet of water. Everything that breathed on dry land died. Genesis is direct and unsparing about this. Every living thing that was on the face of the ground was blotted out. The ark floated for 150 days, 5 months in the dark, rocking 8 people and hundreds of animals, with no way to know when it would end. Noah sent out a raven, then a dove. The second time the dove returned with an olive branch, the first green thing seen in an unknown number of months. The third time, the dove did not come back. The earth was dry enough. And the first act of the family stepping off the ark was to build an altar and offer a sacrifice. And God made a promise that had never been made before and would never need to be made again. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. The covenant was sealed with a rainbow, not a promise to one people, not a covenant with Israel, not an arrangement with the righteous. A covenant with every living creature, with the earth itself. The whole creation is covered by the promise. But the new beginning did not hold. Noah planted a vineyard, drank the wine, became drunk, lay naked in his tent. Ham saw his father's nakedness and told his brothers, apparently with a lack of dignity that the text regards as a form of dishonor. Shem and Japheth walked in backward and covered their father without looking. When Noah woke, he cursed Canaan, Ham's son, and blessed Shem and Japheth. This curse is not incidental. In the Old Testament, nothing is incidental. Centuries later, when Israel enters Canaan and encounters the Canaanites, the reader is supposed to remember this. The seed planted in Genesis chapter 9 germinates in Joshua and Judges. The text has a long memory. If this is opening up the Old Testament in a way you have not seen before, share it with someone who loves to go deep in Scripture. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. This kind of work takes a long time to prepare, and every share helps someone else find it. The post-flood generation spread across the earth. Genesis chapter 10, the so-called Table of Nations, maps 70 peoples descending from Noah's 3 sons. From Shem, the Semites, including the eventual line that leads to Israel. From Ham, the Canaanites, Egyptians, and Philistines. From Japheth, the peoples of Asia Minor and Europe. Every conflict that follows in the Old Testament is, at one level, a family conflict. These are cousins fighting. And then humanity decides collectively to challenge God again. A single language, a single location, the plain of Shinar in what is now southern Iraq. A single project. Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. Babel. Human ingenuity, they invented the fired brick where there was no stone, bitumen where there was no mortar, at the service of human pride. Let us make a name for ourselves. Let us not be scattered. Let us be the center. And God's response is not fire, not a flood. It is something more elegant and more devastating. He confuses the language. From one day to the next, the bricklayer cannot understand the engineer cannot understand the laborer. The project stops. The people scatter, exactly what they were trying to prevent. Genesis chapter 11 verse 9 says the place was called Babel, which sounds like the Hebrew word for confusion. Humanity's first global project ended in linguistic fragmentation. And from this fragmentation, the camera zooms in from all of humanity to one country, to one city, to one man. Abram from Ur of the Chaldeans, a sophisticated cosmopolitan city in southern Mesopotamia, probably polytheistic like every other educated person of his time. And out of nowhere, without context, without explanation, God speaks. Genesis chapter 12 verse 1, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." No map, no defined destination, no guarantee except the word of the one speaking. Just go, trust. And Abram went. At 75 years old, with his barren wife Sarai and his nephew Lot, he started walking toward a place he had never seen. This is the act of faith that serves as the foundation stone for 3 world religions. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all trace their origins to this moment. An elderly man, childless, in a land that was not his, answering a voice that no one else heard. And the promise God made to Abram is the backbone of everything that follows. Genesis chapter 12 verses 2 and 3. "I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Read that last phrase again. All the families of the earth. This is not a tribal arrangement. This is a global plan. A plan to undo the fracturing of Babel and the corruption of Eden, planted in a single family, in a single elderly man, walking toward a land he cannot yet see. He arrived in Canaan. God confirmed the land. But Canaan was not empty. It was occupied by the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hittites, established peoples with fortified cities and organized military forces, and Abram was a nomad with tents and flocks. The gap between the promise and the visible reality was absurd. A great nation starting with a man and a barren woman. A land flowing with milk and honey currently occupied by someone else. The tension between promise and impossibility. This tension is the heartbeat of the entire Abraham narrative. It will beat for 25 years. A famine drives Abram to Egypt, where he introduces Sarai as his sister, technically true, as she was his half-sister, out of fear that the Egyptians would kill him for her. The deception nearly ends in Pharaoh taking her as his wife. God intervenes with plagues, the first of many occasions in this story where Egypt and plagues appear together. Abram leaves Egypt wealthier but carrying a moral compromise that will recur as a pattern in his family for generations. His nephew Lot separates from him and chooses the Jordan plain, fertile and well-watered, near the city of Sodom. Abram stays in the hill country. The choice that seemed obviously better for Lot will prove catastrophically wrong. 4 kings from the east invade the Dead Sea region, defeat 5 local kings including the king of Sodom, and take Lot as a prisoner. When Abram hears the news, he does something no one could have predicted from a nomadic shepherd with tents and herds. He arms 318 trained men born in his own household. He apparently had a private army, pursues the invaders for over 100 miles, attacks at night, and defeats them. He rescues Lot and everything else that was taken. Genesis chapter 14 is one of the most frequently overlooked chapters in the Abraham narrative, and it reveals something crucial. This is not a simple man of faith with no competence in the world. He is a man of faith who is also a capable military commander, a political figure, a man of significant resources. His faith is not escapism. It operates fully in the real world. And on his return from that battle, one of the strangest encounters in the entire Old Testament occurs. Melchizedek, king of Salem, which means king of peace, and Salem is the ancient name for Jerusalem, priest of El Elyon, God Most High. He appears without genealogy, without recorded birth or death, without a tribe or a lineage. He brings bread and wine. He blesses Abram. Abram gives him 1/10 of everything. And then Melchizedek steps back into the narrative silence from which he came, disappearing from the text for 1,000 years until Psalm 110, and then appearing again in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament as a type of the eternal priesthood of Christ. Who is he? The text declines to say, but his appearance in this particular moment, after the battle, before the covenant, is charged with significance that the rest of Scripture will spend centuries unpacking. Abram remains without a child. The years pass. Sarai, watching the promise appear to slip further and further out of reach, makes a decision that will generate consequences until the 21st century. She offers her Egyptian servant Hagar to Abram so that he can father a child through her. It was a legal custom of the time, perfectly recognized in ancient Mesopotamia, and the text does not call it sin, but it was the substitution of a human solution for a divine promise. It was impatience dressed up as practicality. Ishmael is born. Abram is 86 years old, and for 13 years he assumes this is the child the promise was referring to. Then when Abram is 99, God appears again, and he does 2 things. He changes their names. Abram becomes Abraham, father of multitudes. Sarai becomes Sarah, princess, and he tells them the child of the covenant will be born of Sarah herself within a year. Abraham falls on his face. Sarah, listening at the tent entrance, laughs. Genesis chapter 18 verse 14. Is anything too hard for the Lord? A year later, Isaac was born. The name in Hebrew means laughter. Every single time Abraham called his son's name across the fields, he was remembering that God had taken the laughter of unbelief and turned it into the laughter of impossible joy. But the most devastating test was still ahead. Genesis chapter 22. God says, "Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering." After 25 years of waiting for this child, after a biological miracle that defied every natural explanation, after learning that the promises of God can be trusted even when the visible evidence suggests otherwise. Now God asks for the child back. Abraham woke up early the next morning. He cut the wood himself. He saddled the donkey himself. He set out, 3 days of walking, 3 days of knowing what he was walking toward. On the third day, Abraham saw the place from a distance. He told his servants to stay with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come back to you. That last phrase, "we will come back," is either a lie for the servant's comfort or the most extraordinary statement of faith in the entire Old Testament. The writer of Hebrews in chapter 11 interprets it as faith. Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. So he went, believing that somehow, someway, even if the knife fell, God would reverse it. Isaac carried the wood for the burnt offering on his own back up the mountain, a detail the reader of the New Testament cannot encounter without feeling the weight of it. He asked his father, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" And Abraham answered with a sentence that is both the expression of genuine faith and an unwitting prophecy. God will provide for himself the lamb. They arrived at the place. The altar was built. The wood was arranged. Isaac was bound and placed on the altar. Abraham raised the knife. And then the angel of the Lord called from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham, do not lay your hand on the boy." And there, caught in a thicket by its horns, was a ram, a substitute, an animal dying in the place of the son. And Abraham named the place Yahweh, the Lord will provide. And God swore by himself. The writer of Hebrews notes that he could swear by no one greater, to bless Abraham and multiply his descendants, and to bless all nations through his seed. The promise was not revoked. It was confirmed with an oath. This is the central axis of the entire Old Testament. A father who loves his only son. A son who carries the instrument of his own sacrifice up a hill. A substitute dying in the son's place. A declaration that the Lord provides, and a promise, all nations blessed through the seed of this family, renewed at the moment of greatest crisis. If this reminds you of something, it is because it was always meant to. Sarah died at 127 years old. Abraham bought the cave of Machpelah in Hebron to bury her, the first piece of the promised land that Abraham ever legally owned. Not a city, not a farm, a tomb. The land of the promise begins as a cemetery. It is still there. It is still the most contested site in Hebron today, sacred to Jews and Muslims alike. Abraham sent his oldest servant back to Mesopotamia to find a wife for Isaac, because the promised lineage could not marry into the Canaanite culture. The servant found Rebekah by a well, exactly as he had prayed, in a scene of such precision and beauty that it reads like a love story written by Providence itself. Isaac and Rebekah, another barren marriage. Isaac prayed for 20 years. Twin sons were born, and they were fighting in the womb before they were born, which Rebekah found alarming enough to inquire of God about. His answer, "2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, the older shall serve the younger." The older was Esau, red-hairy, a born hunter, a man of the field. The younger was Jacob, smooth, a dweller in tents, quieter, more calculating. The name Jacob in Hebrew means one who takes by the heel, and by implication, a supplanter, a deceiver. He would live up to that name in the first half of his life. Esau sold his birthright for a bowl of red lentil stew. He came in from the field exhausted and famished, and Jacob had food. "I'm about to die," he said. "What use is a birthright to me?" And he traded the inheritance of the firstborn, the double portion, the covenant blessing, the entire trajectory of the promise, for a bowl of food. Genesis chapter 25, verse 34 closes the scene with a sentence of devastating brevity. Thus Esau despised his birthright. A decision made in a moment of appetite, driven by exhaustion and impatience. One meal, the inheritance of centuries. Later, when Isaac was old and blind and believed he was near death, he called Esau to receive his blessing. Rebekah overheard, disguised Jacob in goatskins to mimic Esau's hairy skin, and sent him in to deceive his father. Isaac was suspicious. The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are Esau's hands. He blessed Jacob anyway. When Esau returned and the deception was discovered, Isaac was shaking violently. He could not undo the blessing he had given. The birthright lost over soup and the blessing taken through deception, Jacob had it all. And Esau said what any wronged brother would say, "I will kill him." Jacob fled. He left with nothing but his walking staff. That night, alone in the wilderness, he used a stone for a pillow and fell asleep. And he dreamed of a ladder, a sulam in Hebrew, a staircase or a ramp set up on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God ascending and descending on it. And above it stood the Lord, who spoke the promises he had given to Abraham and Isaac directly to the fleeing, deceiving, stone-sleeping fugitive. "I am with you and will keep you wherever you go." Jacob woke up and said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." He set up the stone as a pillar, poured oil on it, and named the place Bethel, house of God, the same place where Jacob's descendants would later build an altar, the same place that would appear in the prophets. What looks like a stopping point on a desperate flight is actually a founding moment. In the Old Testament, nothing is accidental. Jacob arrived in the east in the household of his uncle Laban. He fell in love with Laban's younger daughter Rachel. He worked 7 years for her. On the wedding night, Laban substituted his older daughter Leah in the darkness, and Jacob, the man who used darkness and deception to steal a blessing, woke up married to the wrong woman. He who deceived his father deceived by his father-in-law. He worked another 7 years for Rachel. He would eventually have 12 sons by 4 women, Leah, Rachel, and their 2 servants Bilhah and Zilpah. 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel, though Israel is not yet his name. 20 years passed in Laban's household. Relationships corroded. God told Jacob to return to Canaan. He gathered his wives and children and flocks and began the journey back. But the closer he got to Canaan, the closer he got to Esau, the brother who had sworn to kill him 20 years ago. Jacob sent gifts ahead, wave after wave of livestock, herds, servants bearing presents with carefully rehearsed speeches. And then he sent his family across the Jabbok River and was left alone on the bank. And someone grabbed him. Genesis chapter 32, verse 24. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. No introduction, no context, just hand-to-hand combat that lasted the entire night. Jacob, who had spent his life winning through cleverness, through substitution and disguise and carefully timed deception, was now in a fight he could not win by being smart. And the mysterious being, unable to overpower Jacob in the conventional sense, touched the socket of his hip with one touch and dislocated it, crippled in an instant. And even limping, even in pain, Jacob would not let go. He said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The being asked, "What is your name?" And Jacob had to speak his own name out loud. Jacob, deceiver. For the first time in the narrative, he did not pretend to be someone else. He said it, and the being said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Israel. The name means one who strives with God. The name of the nation that will be on maps and in headlines for 3,000 years was born from a wrestling match in the dark, given to an imperfect man who refused to let go of God, even when God dislocated his hip. Jacob limped for the rest of his life. The blessing came with a permanent mark. Jacob had 12 sons, but the one who dominates the last 14 chapters of Genesis is the penultimate, the first son of Rachel, the woman Jacob loved, Joseph. Jacob gave him a special robe. His brothers hated him for it. But what turned their hate into something murderous was the dreams. Joseph dreamed that his brothers' sheaves of wheat bowed down to his. He dreamed that the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowed to him. And he told these dreams at the table to the brothers who already resented his status. At 17, when Jacob sent him to check on his brothers in the fields far from home, they saw him coming from a distance and said, "Here comes the dreamer." They seized him. Reuben, the oldest, talked them out of killing him, into throwing him into a pit instead, planning to rescue him later. But while Reuben was away, Judah suggested selling him to a passing caravan of Ishmaelite traders heading to Egypt. 20 pieces of silver. They sold their brother like cargo, and then they killed a goat, dipped his special robe in its blood and brought it to their father. Jacob, the man who deceived his own father with a goatskin, was deceived by his own sons with an animal's blood. He believed Joseph was dead. He mourned for years. Joseph arrived in Egypt as a slave. He was purchased by Potiphar, captain of Pharaoh's guard. And here begins one of the most carefully constructed narrative sequences in the entire Old Testament. Every door that opened for Joseph led immediately to a door slamming shut. Potiphar trusted him with everything, and then Potiphar's wife tried repeatedly to seduce him. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Joseph refused. She grabbed his garment. He ran, leaving it in her hand. She used the garment. The same word is used as for the robe his brothers used, as false evidence. Joseph was thrown into prison. He had gone from the favorite son to a slave to a prisoner. And Genesis repeats a phrase that becomes the structural key to the entire Joseph narrative. The Lord was with Joseph, in Potiphar's house, in the prison, in every place where human circumstances said this is the end, this is as low as it goes, the Lord was with Joseph. In prison, he interpreted the dreams of 2 of Pharaoh's officials. He told the cupbearer, "You will be restored in 3 days." He told the baker, "You will be executed in 3 days." Both happened exactly as he said. He asked the cupbearer, "When you are restored, remember me, mention me to Pharaoh." The cupbearer was restored. He forgot. For 2 full years, Joseph remained in prison because a man who owed him his life forgot him. And then Pharaoh had a dream. 7 fat cows devoured by 7 thin cows. 7 full heads of grain consumed by 7 withered ones. None of his magicians could interpret it, and then the cupbearer finally remembered. There is a Hebrew man in prison who interprets dreams. Joseph was brought out of the dungeon, shaved, dressed in Egyptian clothing, and placed before the most powerful man in the world. And his first words were, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." 7 years of great abundance, 7 years of devastating famine. Egypt needed to store during the abundance or die during the famine. Pharaoh looked at Joseph and said, "Can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God?" That day, Joseph went from prisoner to the second most powerful man in Egypt. He received Pharaoh's signet ring, fine linen robes, a gold chain, an Egyptian name, and a wife. He was 30 years old, 13 years from the pit to the palace. 13 years in which every door that closed was a preparation for the door that was about to open. The famine came, not only to Egypt but Akros, the known world. And back in Canaan, Jacob said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another? I have heard there is grain in Egypt. Go down and buy for us that we may live and not die." 10 brothers went down. Benjamin, the youngest, the other son of Rachel, stayed behind. And when they arrived before the governor of Egypt and bowed to the ground, Joseph recognized them immediately. They did not recognize him. He was Egyptian in dress, manner, and speech. He had been gone for 20 years. The brothers who had bowed were, of course, fulfilling the dream that had made them want to kill him. What follows in Genesis chapters 42 through 45 is one of the most psychologically tense sequences in the Bible. Joseph tested his brothers. He accused them of being spies. He held Simeon as a hostage and sent the rest home. He demanded they bring Benjamin. He hid a silver cup in Benjamin's bag to see whether the brothers had changed, whether they would abandon a second son of Rachel the way they had sold the first. And when Judah, the very one who had suggested selling Joseph, offered himself as a slave in Benjamin's place, Joseph could not maintain the performance. He ordered everyone out of the room, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it in the outer court. Then he said 3 words, "I am Joseph," and his brothers could not answer him. Terror, silence. And then Joseph said something that is the theological summit of the entire book of Genesis. "Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." And then, in what is perhaps the most important single sentence in Genesis, As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive. Human evil is real. It is brutal. It has consequences. Joseph did not minimize what was done to him. He did not pretend it was not painful, but he saw something operating behind and through the evil that was not evil, a purpose that no one had planned and no one could have predicted, moving through the broken choices of broken people toward a destination that only God could see from the beginning. Jacob came down to Egypt with the entire family. Genesis chapter 46 lists 70 names, 70 souls entering a foreign land. When they leave 400 years later, they will number more than 2 million. Jacob met Joseph and said, "Now let me die, since I have seen your face and know that you are still alive." He blessed his 12 sons before he died, and each blessing was a prophecy, but Judah's was the most weighted. "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him." Until something is coming, someone is coming. The scepter, the kingly authority, belongs to Judah's line until the one to whom it ultimately belongs arrives. This is the second great thread of the Old Testament. The first was the seed of the woman who would crush the serpent. The second is the king from Judah to whom the nations will bow. Both threads are running. Both are still unresolved. Joseph died at 110 years old. His last command was a statement of extraordinary faith. "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here." He did not believe Egypt was the destination. He knew it was a parenthesis. He wanted his bones to make the journey. And Genesis ends with a coffin in Egypt and a promise of return. Exodus opens with a sentence that changes everything. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. A generation forgot. The people who had saved Egypt from famine were now seen as a demographic threat. The Hebrews had multiplied so rapidly that Pharaoh panicked. First, enslavement. Forced labor building the storage cities of Pithom and Ramesses, bricks in the sun, mortar and straw. Then, when slavery did not slow the growth, infanticide. Every Hebrew male newborn was to be thrown into the Nile. It was systematic. It was organized. It was a policy of genocide. In that environment, a woman from the tribe of Levi hid her baby for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she made a basket of papyrus reeds. The same Hebrew word teba used here is the same word used for Noah's Ark, the only 2 times it appears in the entire Bible. She sealed it with pitch and tar. She placed the baby in the Nile, the very river designated for Hebrew male deaths, and set it among the reeds at the river's edge. She sent her daughter to watch from a distance. Pharaoh's daughter came to bathe, found the basket, opened it. The baby cried. She had compassion on him. The daughter of the man who ordered the death of every Hebrew boy had compassion on one. The sister appeared. "Shall I go find a Hebrew nurse for the child?" And Moses' own mother was paid by the palace of Pharaoh to nurse her own son. The irony is so precise and so layered that it reads like the fingerprint of a mind operating several moves ahead of every human plan to destroy what it was trying to preserve. Moses grew up in the palace, educated as an Egyptian prince. Acts chapter 7 verse 22 tells us he was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and deeds. Languages, administration, military strategy, Egyptian cosmology and theology. He knew the world he would confront, and he knew who he was. At 40, he went out to see his people and saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He looked both ways. He killed the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. The next day he tried to break up a fight between 2 Hebrews, and one of them said, "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" The secret was out. Moses fled. From the palace of Pharaoh to the wilderness of Midian, from a prince to a shepherd, in a single day. He stayed in Midian for 40 years. 40 years in silence, tending the flocks of his father-in-law Jethro on the backside of the desert. In those 40 years, he learned every trail, every water source, every route through the same wilderness through which he would later lead 2 million people. He learned it not as a military strategy exercise, but as a shepherd looking for pasture. God was teaching him the landscape he would need. Moses did not know that. He was just keeping sheep. At 80 years old, a bush caught fire. and was not consumed. He turned aside to look, and from the fire, the same fire that was on Sinai, the same fire that would descend on the tabernacle, a voice called, "Moses, Moses, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." And God introduced himself. "I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, the God of the promise, the God who made the covenant." And then he said something that the enslaved people in Egypt had not heard from heaven in 400 years. "I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. I have come down to deliver them." 4 centuries of silence. Entire generations born, enslaved, and dead without a single prophetic word. And then I saw, I heard, I know, I have come down. The silence was not abandonment. It was not forgetfulness. It was waiting, with perfect attention, for the moment that the plan required. Moses received the commission to go back to Egypt, and Moses, the man who once killed an Egyptian on impulse, was now suddenly full of reasons why he was the wrong person for this. "Who am I? They will not believe me. I am not eloquent, I am slow of speech. Oh, my Lord, please send someone else." God answered every objection. And when Moses finally asked to be excused from the assignment entirely, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and still God did not abandon him. He gave him Aaron as a spokesperson and sent them both. The commission was not revoked. The calling was not transferred. Just, "Here is help. Now go." Moses stood before Pharaoh and delivered the simplest message in diplomatic history. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go." Pharaoh's answer was equally simple. "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." He was going to know. 10 plagues, each one escalating, each one deliberately targeting a specific deity in the Egyptian theological system. The Nile turned to blood, attacking Hapi, the god of the Nile. Frogs attacking Hecate, the frog-headed goddess. Gnats, flies, the death of livestock, boils, hail with fire, locusts that consumed what the hail had not already destroyed. 3 days of total darkness across all of Egypt, attacking Ra, the sun god, the supreme deity. 9 times Pharaoh's heart hardened. 9 times the answer was no, and then came the 10th, the one that could not be reversed. At midnight, the angel of death moved through Egypt. Every firstborn, from the firstborn of Pharaoh on the throne to the firstborn of the prisoner in the dungeon, died. Everyone, except where blood had been applied. God had given specific instructions: a lamb without defect, slaughtered at twilight, its blood applied to the doorposts and the lintel of the house. When the destroyer saw the blood, it would pass over. The word in Hebrew is pesach, to leap over, to pass over. Passover. Liberation required blood. A lamb died so the firstborn could live. And the entire sacrificial system of the Old Testament, every lamb, every ram, every bull offered on every altar from this night forward would echo this night. The blood on the door, the death that was redirected. That night Pharaoh summoned Moses and said, "Up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel." And 600,000 men, not counting women and children, making the total more than 2 million out of Egypt after 430 years, and they took the bones of Joseph. The promise made by a man on his deathbed 400 years earlier was kept. But Pharaoh changed his mind. He mobilized 600 elite chariot units and pursued them. The Israelites looked up and saw the Egyptian army behind them and the Red Sea in front. And the people did what the people always do in crisis. They turned on Moses. "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to die?" And Moses said what God's servants always say when there is no human solution: "Fear not. Stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord." God told Moses to stretch out his staff over the sea. An east wind blew through the entire night. The waters divided, 2 walls of water, dry ground between them. 2 million people walked across the floor of the sea. And when the Egyptians followed, their chariot wheels locked in the mud, the sea returning, not one survived. Exodus chapter 14 verse 30. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. And on that bank the people sang. Exodus chapter 15, the Song of Moses, is considered one of the oldest pieces of poetry in the entire Bible. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. Miriam took a tambourine, and all the women went out dancing. Yesterday they were slaves, today they were free. Freedom, however, is harder than anyone imagined. 3 days after crossing the sea, they arrived at Marah, and the water was bitter. They complained. God showed Moses a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. Weeks later, they were in the wilderness of Sin with no food. Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots. They wanted to go back. Slavery with food seemed better than freedom with uncertainty. And God, with a patience that is one of the most staggering features of the entire Old Testament, provided. Manna, bread from heaven, appearing on the ground every morning like frost white with the taste of honey wafers. Every day, for 40 years, without missing once. 3 months after Egypt, they arrived at Sinai. And what happened there changed human civilization permanently. The Lord descended on the mountain in fire and smoke and earthquake. The whole mountain trembled violently. The people were forbidden to come near or even touch the mountain on pain of death. And from the fire and the cloud God spoke 10 words, 10 commandments, not suggestions, not preferred behaviors, commandments, engraved by the finger of God on 2 tablets of stone. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet. 10 principles that became the moral foundation of the Western world. Every modern legal code, from Roman law through the Enlightenment to contemporary civil jurisprudence, carries the DNA of those tablets. And along with the 10 Commandments came the entire covenantal structure of the Mosaic Law, more than 600 statutes governing food, hygiene, social justice, property, agriculture, disease, civil construction, slavery, marriage, and worship. And at the center of all of it, the tabernacle, a portable sanctuary, detailed in Exodus chapters 25 through 40 with such precision that it occupies more text than the entire creation account. Gold, silver, bronze, acacia wood, fine linen, ram skins dyed red, every material with theological significance. The outer court, the holy place, the Holy of Holies at the center containing the Ark of the Covenant with the tablets inside, and above it the mercy seat, the Kaporet, the place of atonement, flanked by 2 golden cherubim facing each other across it. And over the mercy seat between the cherubim, the presence of God, the creator of the universe dwelling in a tent in the middle of the desert, accessible to his people through blood and sacrifice, present in the very center of their camp. Moses spent 40 days on the mountain receiving these instructions. And what did the people do while he was gone? 40 days. Only 40 days after hearing the voice of God thundering from the mountain, after seeing the fire and the smoke, after saying in unison, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, they went to Aaron and said, "Make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Aaron, the high priest, the designated spokesman of God, the brother of Moses, melted their gold earrings and fashioned a golden calf and said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." When Moses came down the mountain and saw the dancing and the calf, he threw the tablets of the law to the ground and they shattered at the foot of the mountain. The covenant lasted less time than the stone it was written on. Moses ground the calf to powder and made the people drink it. 3,000 died that day. And then Moses did something extraordinary. He went back up the mountain and said to God, "But now, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written." He offered himself as a substitute for people who had just betrayed the God he represented. God remade the tablets, a second set, a second chance. This is the rhythmic pattern of the entire Old Testament. Sin, Consequence, judgment, mercy, restoration, repeated again and again. God's patience is not indifference. It is endurance with a purpose. If this is opening up the Old Testament as a unified narrative for you, share it with someone who needs to encounter the scripture at this level of depth. Leave a comment. Subscribe. This kind of work is built for people who want to go deeper than the surface. Numbers chapter 13. After Sinai, after the tabernacle is built and consecrated, the people stand on the edge of Canaan. Moses sends 12 spies, one from each tribe, to scout the land for 40 days. They return carrying a single cluster of grapes so heavy it requires 2 men to carry it on a pole. The land is exactly what God described: milk and honey, every good thing. But 10 of the 12 spies give a disqualifying report. The people are larger and stronger than we are. Their cities are fortified and very large. We seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them. Only 2, Joshua and Caleb, said, "If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us." The congregation wept all night. They cried for a leader to take them back to Egypt. And God said, "You want the wilderness, you will have it. 40 years, 1 year for each day the spies spent in the land. Every person 20 years old and above who had come out of Egypt would die in the wilderness without ever entering Canaan. Every one, except 2, Joshua and Caleb, the only ones who believed. The entire generation that witnessed the Exodus, the Red Sea crossing, the manna, Sinai, the tabernacle, condemned to die in the desert for the choice made in a single night of fear. Funerals every day, graves in the sand, a nation walking in circles until the last man and woman of that generation fell. And in the midst of those 40 years, even Moses failed. At Meribah, the people complained of thirst. God told Moses to speak to the rock. Moses was exhausted and angry, and he struck it twice with his staff. Water gushed out. The people drank. But God said, "Because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them." Moses would not enter Canaan. The man who faced Pharaoh, divided the sea, climbed Sinai barefoot, and carried this impossible people on his back for 4 decades, barred at the door for a single unauthorized strike of a staff. The text is saying something about the weight of leadership. The one who represents God before millions does not have the luxury of impulse. The greater the responsibility entrusted, the smaller the margin for departure from the word of God. Moses bore the penalty not because God was cruel, but because the principle was too important to overlook even once, even for the greatest leader Israel had ever known. Deuteronomy chapter 34. Moses climbed Mount Nebo. God showed him the entire land: Gilead, Dan, Naphtali, Ephraim, Manasseh, Judah, the western sea, the Negeb, the Jordan Valley, Jericho, everything the promise had included, every foot of it visible from this mountain. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. And Moses died there at 120 years old. The text says his eye was undimmed and his vigor unabated. God himself buried him. And no one knows where his grave is. The text closes with a eulogy. And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Joshua took command, and God said what he says to every terrified leader: "Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." The Jordan River was at flood stage, impossible to cross. God commanded the priests to carry the Ark of the Covenant and walk into the river. The moment their feet touched the water, the river stopped, piling up in a heap far upstream. 2 million people crossed on dry ground. Again. Same miracle, same God, second generation. Jericho was the first city in the way. Fortified walls, locked gates. The military logic of any commander would say, lay siege, build ramps. Use battering rams. God's instruction. March around it in silence for 6 days, once per day. On the 7th day, 7 circuits, trumpets, shout. And the walls collapsed outward, according to the physical evidence at the excavation site, which is exactly the opposite of what happens when a wall falls under conventional attack. The attackers walked straight in over the rubble. The conquest of Canaan took approximately 7 years. 31 kings defeated, the land divided among 12 tribes. Joshua's last words to the people were a choice placed directly in their hands. Choose this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. They chose the Lord that day. The next generation forgot. The generation after that forgot more. The book of Judges records one of the most repetitive and tragic cycles in human history. The people abandon the Lord. The Lord allows an enemy to oppress them. The people cry out. The Lord raises up a judge, a temporary military deliverer who rescues them. Peace for a generation. Then the cycle restarts. 12 judges across roughly 300 years. Deborah led Israel to victory against 900 iron chariots. Gideon defeated 135,000 Midianites with 300 men carrying torches inside clay jars and trumpets. No conventional weapons. Samson was the strongest man alive and was destroyed not by an army but by his own inability to manage desire. He told Delilah his secret. She told the Philistines. And he died pulling down a temple on 3,000 people, killing more in his death than in his life. Judges ends with a phrase that is its own indictment. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Total moral anarchy. The absence of kingship had produced the absence of order, and the absence of order had produced the absence of justice. The solution the people decided on, a king like the nations around them. Samuel, the last judge, the first of the great writing prophets, warned them with exact precision about what a king would do. He will take your sons for his armies and your daughters for his kitchens. He will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive orchards. He will take 1/10 of your grain and 1/10 of your flocks. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you. The people did not care. No, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations. God gave them Saul, tall, physically impressive, a head taller than any other Israelite. Everything that looks like leadership from the outside. He started well, but power revealed what was underneath. He disobeyed direct divine commands. He offered sacrifices reserved for the priesthood when Samuel was late to arrive, because he was afraid the people were scattering. He spared the Amalekite king Agag and the best of the livestock after being commanded to destroy everything, and then told Samuel he had carried out the command of the Lord. Samuel's response in 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 22 is one of the most important statements about worship in the entire Old Testament. Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. And then the verdict: because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. While Saul still occupied the throne, God sent Samuel to Bethlehem, to the house of a man named Jesse. 7 of Jesse's sons passed before Samuel, tall, strong, impressive. None of them. Samuel asked, "Are there any others?" There was one more, the youngest. He was out keeping the sheep. They brought him in. A ruddy teenager, bright-eyed, handsome, and God said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he, David, shepherd, poet, musician, warrior, king." The man after God's own heart, not because he was perfect, but because when confronted with his imperfection, he did not reach for excuses. He reached for God. With a stone from a stream and a sling, he killed Goliath, a Philistine warrior nearly 9 feet tall, covered in bronze armor, who had stood before Israel's army for 40 days, issuing daily challenges and receiving daily silence. Nobody went out, and a teenager walked down to the valley and said, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts." 1 stone, 1 sling. Goliath fell face forward on the ground. And what happened afterward was not a celebration. Saul, watching from a distance, felt something take root in his heart that would haunt the next decade: jealousy. Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. The women's song after the battle confirmed what he feared, and from that day, Saul kept his eye on David. David fled for why? Years he lived in caves. He led a band of men who were in distress, in debt, and discontented, the discarded, the rejected, the ones who had failed by every conventional measure, and he built them into a fighting force. He had 2 opportunities to kill Saul and refused both times. I will not put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. When Saul died in battle against the Philistines on Mount Gilboa, David did not celebrate. He composed a lament. O mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you. How the mighty have fallen. David reigned first over Judah, then over all Israel. He conquered Jerusalem from the Jebusites, the city that had never fallen to any tribe of Israel, and made it the capital. He brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, dancing before it in the street with such uninhibited joy that his wife Michal watched from a window and despised him in her heart. He drew up plans for a permanent temple to replace the portable tabernacle. And God made a promise to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7 that joins the great chain of promises running through the Old Testament from Eden forward. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. The seed of the woman, the blessing for all nations through Abraham's seed, the king from Judah's line, and now the eternal throne of David. The arrows are converging. But then David looked from his rooftop. He saw a woman bathing. Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of his 30 mighty men, one of his most faithful soldiers. David sent for her. He lay with her. She became pregnant. And to conceal what he had done, David brought Uriah back from the front and tried to get him to go home to his wife. Uriah refused. How could he sleep in his house while his fellow soldiers were camped in open fields? So David sent him back to the front with a letter in his own hand. Set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, that he may be struck down and die. Uriah was killed. David married Bathsheba, and for months, silence. No acknowledgement, no repentance, just the continuation of normal life over a man buried in the ground by his commander's deliberate arrangement. God sent the prophet Nathan. He told a story about a rich man with many flocks who, when a traveler came to his house, refused to take one of his own animals for the meal. Instead, he took the one little ewe lamb belonging to his poor neighbor, a lamb the man had raised like a daughter. David's reaction was fury. As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. And Nathan looked at him and said, You are the man. The sentence that followed was severe. The sword shall never depart from your house. The child born of that union died. David's son Amnon raped his half-sister Tamar. David's son Absalom killed Amnon in revenge and then, years later, launched a coup to take the throne from his own father. David fled Jerusalem on foot, weeping, barefoot, head covered. The man after God's own heart, driven from his own capital by his own son. The consequences of the rooftop night ran through the rest of his life, like a wound that kept reopening. But David's response to Nathan's confrontation is the thing that separates him from Saul forever. He did not give excuses. He did not minimize. He said 4 words, I have sinned against the Lord. And then he wrote Psalm 51, one of the most honest prayers in human history. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Not, explain how my circumstances led to this. Not, account for the complexity of my situation. I have sinned against the Lord. The difference between David and Saul is not the size of their sins. It is the direction they turned when confronted with them. Solomon, son of David and Bathsheba, inherited the throne. God appeared to him in a dream. Ask what I shall give you. Solomon asked for wisdom, for a hearing heart to govern this people, to discern between good and evil. And God gave him everything. Wisdom beyond any human being before or after him, wealth that made the nations come to see, power that extended from the Euphrates to the border of Egypt. He built the temple in Jerusalem in 7 years, the permanent home for the ark, the permanent dwelling of the divine presence. Cedar from Lebanon, carved stone, gold on the walls and the floor and the altar and the lampstands and the cherubim. When the ark was brought into the Holy of Holies and the priests came out, the cloud of God's presence, the Shekinah, filled the temple so completely that the priests could not stand to perform their duties. The tabernacle of the wilderness, was now a house of stone and gold on the hill of Zion. But Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, made the most predictable mistake in the history of human wisdom. He married foreign women, many of them. 700 wives, 300 concubines, women from nations God had specifically prohibited because they would turn his heart to their gods, and they did. In his old age, 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 4, his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. He built high places for Chemosh the god of Moab. He built altars for Molech the god of Ammon. He burned incense and made sacrifices to gods he knew were not God. The wisest man who ever lived became the most foolish, and God said, "The kingdom will be torn away from your son." After Solomon, the split. The 10 northern tribes broke away under Jeroboam to form the northern kingdom of Israel. The 2 southern tribes remained as the kingdom of Judah, retaining Jerusalem and the temple. And from this point forward, the Bible tracks 2 royal lines heading in 2 directions, both of them largely downward. The northern kingdom had 19 kings over 200 years. Not one of them was assessed as faithful to the Lord. Not one. Jeroboam the first immediately set up 2 golden calves, one at Bethel, one at Dan, and told the people, "Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." He did not want the people traveling to Jerusalem to worship. They might defect to the south. So he gave them local worship of something that was not God. And every northern king who followed him is measured by the standard. He walked in the way of Jeroboam. Against this darkness, God raised up prophets. The greatest was Elijah, the prophet who appeared suddenly without genealogy in 1 Kings chapter 17 to tell King Ahab, the most corrupt king of the north, that there would be no rain except at his word. 3 years of drought. Then the confrontation on Mount Carmel, Elijah against 450 prophets of Baal. Both sides built altars. Both called on their God to send fire. The prophets of Baal cried out from morning until noon. "O Baal, answer us." Nothing. Elijah mocked them. "Cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is musing, or he is relieving himself, or he is asleep and must be awakened." They danced around the altar and cut themselves until the blood flowed. Nothing. Then Elijah rebuilt the altar of the Lord with 12 stones, dug a trench around it, and doused everything with 12 jars of water until the water ran off the altar and filled the trench. And he prayed a prayer of 33 words. And fire fell from heaven and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, the dust, and all the water in the trench. The people fell on their faces. "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." The 450 prophets of Baal were executed. But the southern kingdom of Judah was not much better. Interspersed with occasional good kings, Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, Josiah, were kings who burned their children in sacrificial fire to Molech in the valley of Hinnom outside Jerusalem. Into this century after century of faithlessness and injustice and idolatry, God kept sending prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Hosea, Micah, each one with the same core message: return, repent, justice is coming. But embedded in the warnings were promises, seeds planted in the darkest soil that would not germinate for centuries. Isaiah wrote in chapter 53, 700 years before anyone knew who he was describing, "He was wounded for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his stripes we are healed." The suffering servant, who carries the sin of the people, who is led like a lamb to the slaughter, who is buried with the wicked but whose grave is with a rich man. Isaiah did not understand everything he was writing, but the thread was there. Jeremiah promised in chapter 31 a new covenant. "I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, 'Know the Lord,' for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest." Not like the covenant made at Sinai, which could be broken and was, by human faithlessness. A covenant written internally, permanent. Grounded not in human performance, but in divine action. In 722 BC, Assyria invaded the northern kingdom. Israel fell. The 10 tribes were deported, scattered, assimilated into the surrounding peoples. They disappear from history. Then in 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon did the unthinkable. He destroyed Jerusalem. He burned the temple that Solomon had built, the cedar and the gold and the carved cherubim, to ash. He melted the bronze pillars and the bronze sea. He took the people, those who survived the siege and the sword, to Babylon in chains. Psalm 137 captures the devastation. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our lyres, for there our captors required of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land?" The temple ashes, the throne of David vacant, the promised land occupied by foreigners. The covenant seemed broken, everything seemed lost. 70 years of exile. But in Babylon, Daniel was thrown into a den of lions by the command of a king who admired him but could not protect him from his enemies. And he came out the next morning without a mark. His 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were thrown into a furnace heated 7 times hotter than normal. And when the king looked in, he saw 4 figures walking in the fire, and the 4th, he said, looked like a son of the gods. They walked out without the smell of smoke on their clothing. And Daniel prophesied, with the specificity of a man who was being told rather than guessing, the rise and fall of kingdoms: Persia, Greece, Rome. Historians and archaeologists have been studying those prophecies ever since. In 539 BC, Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon in a single night, a conquest Isaiah had prophesied 150 years earlier, naming Cyrus by name before he was born. Cyrus issued a decree. The exiled peoples could return to their homelands. The Jews could go back to Jerusalem. Ezra led the first wave of returnees, carrying the vessels of the temple that Nebuchadnezzar had taken. Nehemiah rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem in 52 days, the workers holding a construction tool in one hand and a sword in the other, because the surrounding peoples were actively trying to stop the rebuilding. The second temple was built, smaller, simpler, without the Ark of the Covenant, which had disappeared and was never found again. When the older men who had seen the first temple saw the foundation of the second, they wept, not with joy, with longing. The gap between what was and what was now was so wide that even the beginning of restoration was a grief. But the prophet Haggai said, "The latter glory of this house shall be greater than the former. The best is still coming." The last prophet of the Old Testament was Malachi. He prophesied around 430 BC. And then silence, 400 years of it. Not a single prophetic voice in 4 centuries. The longest silence in the history of the relationship between God and Israel. But during those 400 years, the promises were still suspended, still unanswered. The seed of the woman who would crush the serpent, still not revealed. The blessing of all nations through Abraham's seed, still not enacted. The eternal throne of David, still vacant. The suffering servant of Isaiah, still unnamed. The new covenant of Jeremiah written on hearts, still not inaugurated. Every arrow shot in 4,000 years of Old Testament history was still in the air. The Old Testament does not end with a period. It ends with a comma and a forward lean. Every lamb sacrificed on every altar pointed forward. Every Passover meal pointed forward. Every year of Jubilee pointed forward. Every throne that disappointed pointed forward to the one that would not disappoint. Every prophet who said, "Thus says the Lord," was borrowing authority from a word that had not yet been fully spoken. The entire Old Testament is a story that stops in the middle of its own most important sentence. The subject has been announced. The verb has been promised. And the world has been waiting for 400 years for the sentence to be completed. If this study has opened up the Old Testament as a single coherent story for you, if you can see the thread running from Genesis to Malachi, share it with someone who needs to encounter Scripture this way. Subscribe, leave a comment, pray for this channel. God bless you.